Hey everybody, welcome back to my Flickers of Fear series. So, prequels, particularly horror prequels, I feel like, they're kind of a tricky proposition, like even under the best of circumstances. Because I kind of feel like even one that's good still kind of runs the risk of maybe being like a little bit pointless because, people have seen what happened after that and, so there won't really be any surprises in store. Or I kind of feel like some of them go the route of doing too much fan service. Like, hey, here's how this got like this, and here's how this beloved character got their catchphrase or this item that they always use or something like that. And like, isn't that neat? Which, not usually. So I guess for those very reasons, I really previously had not had much interest in watching the movie that came out, I believe is in spring of 2024, The First Omen. Even though I'm a huge fan of the 1976, the original Omen film, and the two sequels that came after it, I admit that I haven't seen the fourth one, I guess, that was called The Awakening from 1991. I haven't seen that one, but I love the original one, and the other two, like Part 2 and Part 3, are pretty great too. But it so happened that on the late afternoon of Christmas Day, we'd already opened all the presents, and I was kind of stuffed to the gills with glazed ham and desserts and like all the sides and stuff. So I wanted to just kind of like chill out and relax and just have a cup of coffee, watch a movie. And I saw that The First Omen was streaming on Hulu. And then I kind of remembered that it had turned up on a bunch of, best horror of the year lists. So I thought I'd maybe give it a whirl. And damn, it was actually much better than I was expecting. And I kind of feel like it was a much classier movie and like a much more high quality film than it really had any right to be, I guess. This is actually the feature film debut of Arkasha Stevenson. Now, she had actually worked on some TV series before. She worked on Legion, which like that Marvel series, and Briar Patch. And she also did the third season of Channel Zero, The Butcher's Block, which was actually quite good. So, but this was her feature film debut, and damn, like she did a really good job. I kind of feel like she homaged the original 1976 Omen in really interesting ways without this story being like a retread of that. And it really very nicely filled in the blanks from the 1976 film with kind of unexpected details that still fit into the movie's lore, you know what I mean? I also felt like the characters were really good, very well sketched, the acting was great. And I feel like the protagonist, in particular, like the main girl, she was really sympathetic and a pretty compelling character to see the story through. So at the very beginning of the movie, which is set in Rome in 1971, in case you didn't know, there's a very brief scene that features Father Brennan. He's actually played here by Ralph Ineson, and this is the same character that was in the 1976 one, but in that movie he was played by Patrick Troughton, but he has passed away since then. So they have a different actor playing, but they look kind of similar, but it's the same character. So Father Brennan is talking to another priest named Father Harris, who's played by the great Charles Dance. Now, just prior to their talk, there's a great shot of like a stained glass window that's kind of being hoisted into place, like up on this building, like way high up. And there's a shot of the window up here, and then Father Brennan like way down on the ground, like looking up at it. And the angle that it's shot at, like, immediately puts you on guard. Like, you've seen the original movie, right? You know that at some point this window is going to fall and like slice someone in two or something like that, because that's how the Omen rolls. You know what I'm saying? But the great thing about this movie is that it sets these kind of things up. It doesn't do it a bunch of times, but a couple of times where you're just like, I see what you did there. It kind of sets this kind of stuff up on purpose just to kind of fuck with your expectations a little bit by doing something that you don't quite foresee. So Brennan is asking about some sinister conspiracy at the church, and Harris hands him like this old photograph of two nuns and a cardinal who are like holding a baby. And on the back of the picture, somebody has written the word or name or whatever it is, Ciarra, like in pencil. Now, as Father Harris is walking away, that pesky stained glass window, you know what I mean? Chekhov's stained glass window, indeed comes loose from the riggings, as you knew that it would. And there's this great like slow motion sequence where all of these little tiny shards of like colored glass are like kind of raining down around the two priests. And at this point, you're just kind of waiting for the hammer to fall, or for the stained glass window to fall, I guess, assuming, as I did, that like a pole from the scaffolding or something like that is going to come plunging down right through Father Harris's body, which is what happens to Father Brennan in the 1976 one. But that's not quite what happens. Like, there is a noise, and Harris does kind of stop short, like he's surprised, but the window actually falls kind of some distance from him. And he seems okay. And Brennan is asked, like, man, are you all right? And Harris is like, yeah, I'm fine. And he walks off, but he's like a little bit unsteady. And then we see, like, after he turns his back, that a falling pipe or something like that has actually made this huge hole, like, in the back of his skull, and his brain is kind of peeping through. So I thought that was, like, a nice little surprise. It kind of gave a nod to the iconic scene from the original, one with Father Brennan being impaled by the pole, without kind of slavishly duplicating it. So then we move on to our main character, who is a young novitiate named Margaret. Now, she grew up in the U.S., but she's an orphan and has been in the care of the church, her entire life. Now, at the behest of her mentor, protector, father figure guy, whose name is Cardinal Lawrence, who's actually played by Bill Nighy, she's actually come to Rome to work as a teacher in an orphanage and to also, like, eventually take her vows, like, as a nun. So she's kind of this very wide-eyed, naive kind of girl. She's very devoted to the church with pretty much every fiber of her being, because that's like all she's ever known. Now, this being Rome in the early 1970s, there are a whole bunch of like protests in the streets, because you have kind of like you'd had in the United States where, younger people are kind of rebelling against the authority of their elders, and particularly against the power of the Catholic Church. So this cultural conflict is like a really good backdrop for the story, because it kind of gives, it's just kind of around the fringes of the main narrative, but it also kind of gives like a larger impetus for the nefarious shenanigans that are going to be following. So Margaret settles into the orphanage, like moves in there. And almost immediately she notices and kind of hones in on this slightly older girl whose name is Carlita. And she seems very troubled. And she's just constantly being disciplined by the abbess, whose name is Sister Silva, by being locked into what they call the bad room. It's kind of this shitty blank room with like a stained mattress and all this other kind of crap. Now, Margaret like admits to her that she's like, I was a bit of a problem child myself. And so she kind of feels an affinity with this girl. But the abbess basically says, don't get involved with Carlita. She's a bad kid, and she's deliberately being kept away from the other kids, I'm assuming to like prevent her from corrupting them. Now, not too long after arriving, Margaret meets her beautiful roommate, neighbor, the person in the next room, whatever, whose name is Luz. And she's also going to take her vows, but evidently wants to just kind of party hardy up until the very moment that happens, which she gives the very reasonable argument that, hey, if you're going to become a nun, you better have an idea of all the things that you're giving up, like, to do that. So to that end, Luz persuades Margaret to dress up in kind of some skimpy, like, fabulous club hoe attire so they can go out and paint the town, you know what I mean? And see what they're going to be missing out on after they take their vows as nuns. So they end up at this humongous, like, nightclub, and they meet two kind of decent looking dudes who buy them drinks and the whole spiel. Now, Margaret, of course, is very awkward at first, and her date, I guess, for the evening, whose name is Paolo, he's kind of looking pretty disappointed because he got saddled with the wallflower, right, instead of like the hotter, more outgoing girl. But, as the alcohol begins flowing more freely, Margaret's inhibitions like start to fall by the wayside. And soon enough, she's dancing and making out with Paolo like a champ. So then we cut to the next scene where Margaret is waking up with a hangover and a complete memory blackout. We've all been there. I think she's in Liz's room, like in her bed. Now, Liz assures her, it's like, no, you didn't embarrass yourself last night. I pulled you out of there before anything too crazy happened. But then she says, with a little bit of a wink, she says, but what did happen is our little secret. You know what I mean? So we're led to assume that Margaret maybe actually did have sex with Paolo, although this isn't really stated outright. Now, in other news, like, despite, everyone telling her to stay away from Carlita because she's a bad kid, Margaret is still, like, pretty curious about her and kind of wants to help her and wants to interact with her. Now, from the girl's drawings, because she does all these weird drawings, she believes that Carlita is having the same kinds of terrifying visions that she used to have when she was younger, and still kind of has every now and then. And she is trying to reassure Carlita that, yes, these visions are really scary, but they're not real and they can be managed. So, don't be afraid. Now, at one point, for example, saying that Margaret still has these visions too, she's actually witnesses a woman at the facility, like, giving birth, because this orphanage also takes in, like, unwed mothers, you know what I mean? So she's watching this woman give birth, and this horrible, like, clawed demon hand, like, comes popping out of the woman's vagina, and this, like, stresses her the fuck out, and she passes out. Now, not too long after this, old Father Brennan from the beginning of the movie, he approaches Margaret kind of out in public, like in a square or something. Now, she's pretty wary at first because she doesn't know him, and he comes up to her like he does know her. He seems to know like exactly who she is, like her name and where she's at and where she came from and everything like that, which makes her even more suspicious, right? Now, he tells her, he's like, look, I have some really important information that you need to hear. You need to come to my apartment later. We can't really talk here, so you need to come and I can tell you this stuff. Margaret takes the address, but clearly thinks he's a nut and is just kind of like, yeah, I'll totally do that. It's like, phew, and then Liz like gets away from him, Now, there's also this one really weird nun at the orphanage who's called Sister Angelica. And she seems to have a kind of a creepy, almost a sexual fascination with Carlita. Now, Margaret kind of approaches them one day while everyone's kind of out in the courtyard doing their little recess or whatever. And Carlita shows her a drawing of a pregnant woman that she had done. And then Angelica had like drawn the fetus or something like that, like inside the woman's uterus. And Margaret tells Angelica, she's like, well, I feel like that's kind of inappropriate or whatever. And then Angelica gets kind of hostile and then suddenly gets up and like straight on kisses her on the mouth and then just kind of like stalks off. And then moments later, we see Angelica standing on the balcony of the building, like over the courtyard, with what looks like a rope or like a piece of fabric or sheet or something like around her neck. Now, again, we think that we're getting a repeat of, the nanny's It's All For You hanging scene, like from the 1976 movie. But this scene, it's similar, but it plays out like slightly differently because Angelica actually sets herself on fire first and then jumps off the balcony. And then she's just dangling and burning there, like crashing through a window in the process. And all the nuns and the orphans in the courtyard are just looking up in complete and abject horror. So after all this, Margaret finally begins to suspect that, yeah, maybe something weird might be going on at this orphanage. So she decides to go and see Father Brennan. Now, he tells her about the conspiracy, which was alluded to in the 1976 movie, that there's kind of a radical subset within the church that's sort of lamenting the church's declining influence on society as a whole. And the method they've decided on to combat that is they need to frighten people back into the arms of the church by deliberately engineering the birth of the Antichrist, which seems like a lot of work and it's kind of overkill, but hey, like they are radicals after all. So these people, says Father Brennan, have a beast, and he suspects that Carlita is being groomed to be impregnated by this beast so that she'll give birth to the Antichrist on June 6th, because obviously 666, you know what I mean? Now, Brennan wants Margaret to bring him proof, like go in the files, like break in and, bring him proof of what these miscreants are up to so he can expose them. But the more he tells the story and he's getting kind of more passionate about it, so Margaret just thinks he's even crazier than she did at first, and she just like gets the fuck out of there. After that, though, several things occur that eventually convince Margaret that what Brennan said was true. One of these is this pretty horrific scene involving Paolo, the man that she met and supposedly slept with, like at the nightclub that night. And she also starts to become terrified on Carlita's behalf, and she wants to protect her, and she vows to like get her away from this orphanage. We both need to get away from here, like you're in danger. But her erratic behavior and her kind of trying to call out like her superiors at the orphanage kind of brings down the wrath of the cardinal and the abbess, and they kind of accuse her of being unstable because they know her history and everything. So they start like locking her away in the bad room. It's like, she's crazy, don't listen to her, all this other kind of stuff. So from there, like things sort of go from bad to worse as the radicals' malevolent plot is put into motion. And the situation turned out to be a lot more fucked up than even Father Brennan thought it was. So yeah, I feel like this movie was like a really refreshing surprise. Like I said, I wasn't expecting too much from it, but it was actually like way better than I thought it was going to be. And I feel like this was a prequel done right. Like it referenced the legacy of the 1976 film, which of course is a classic, but it told its own interesting story that also expanded on the lore of the franchise without repeating stuff. You know what I mean? I particularly liked how a couple of the iconic sequences from the original film were kind of subverted in a sort of playful way, but not in a winky kind of way, which I don't really like, but just in a way that it's like, hey, you thought it was going to like go like this, but then it went like that. Yeah, so it did that without making me go, oh, geez, and roll my eyes or whatever. And I mean, to be honest, this was actually quite satisfying as a standalone story, even removed from, the parameters of the Omen mythology. It's better if you know what happens in the Omen, but you can watch this without that. Like, you don't really need to know. And it had some like really creepy scenes, like a couple really eerie sequences, had some good gore in it. And I feel like the lead performance was really fantastic. It really kind of drew you. She really draws you into the tale. You're very emotionally invested in her character. And you're kind of invested in this unfolding mystery because you don't really want anything bad to happen to her. The look of the film was also, really lovely. It was kind of homaging, obviously, the 70s film, so it had that kind of same aesthetic to it. But one interesting choice that they made was all of the religious characters. They kind of dressed them as though they were from a few decades prior. Like, they looked more like they were from the 1940s. And I thought that was a really good, because it kind of emphasized maybe like their diminishing power in the modern world, but it was still kind of subtle. So I really liked the costume design, like in that regard, that kind of, kind of expanded on the story without calling attention to itself. So yeah, I have to say, even though I wasn't, like I said, I wasn't super enthused to see this, because I'm like, oh, a prequel, like how good can that be? But I'm actually glad I gave it a chance, because I ended up liking this quite a lot. So that will do it for this Flickers of Fear. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember, like, share, subscribe, and comment. And I will see you guys again on the next one. Bye.